Bonjour tout le monde, merci pour votre invitation à prendre la parole à cette conférence. C'est un grand honneur et j'ai le plaisir de retourner à Montréal. Comme dit Serge et Mathieu, je suis Adam, je suis gallois, je viens au Pays de Galles, mais maintenant j'habite à Melbourne en Australie. Je suis vraiment désolé, mais mon français est assez terrible, alors je vais devoir continuer en anglais. Alright, so the talk is titled Chemsex, Prevalence, Problems and Possibilities, and that's very much the structure and the order that I want to follow in this talk today. But first, before even talking about the prevalence of chemsex, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Everyone kind of has their head around the definitions and the meanings that we're talking about here, so that you can understand how I'm approaching this and the research that I've been involved in as I'm talking through the rest of the slides. So, a working definition of chemsex, and this does evolve sometimes over time, is sex that occurs under the influence of drugs that's taken immediately preceding or during a sexual session, and it's a term typically used in relation to sex between men. Now, there's an important distinction to be made between sex under the use of drugs that is deliberate. I'm using these drugs in order to facilitate a sexual encounter, compared to drug use which is kind of coincidental. I happened to go out on a Friday night, I took some cocaine, I picked up a guy in a bar and I had sex with him. I happened to still be high when I did it. That's coincidental in nature. Chemsex is what we think of as a much more deliberate act, and that's a useful definition to hold in your mind. The drugs associated with chemsex vary a great deal depending on where you are in the world. As with all drug use, it varies by country and it varies by city as well. And it's impossible to give a definitive list of the drugs that are definitely always involved in chemsex, because it does change from place to place. I think what's important to understand is that whether they are stimulants that people are using, whether they're dissociative drugs that people are using, they all have sexually arousing properties. So they may raise your heart rate and your blood pressure and make you feel tactile, and all those things that certain stimulants do. But in order to be associated with chemsex, typically they're drugs that also arouse sexual feelings. They make you feel quite horny at the same time. So in much of Europe, much of Western Europe and in the UK, we mostly talk about mephedrone, GHB or GBL, or crystal methamphetamine. In Central and Eastern Europe, ketamine is also brought into the mix, much more so than we've typically seen in the UK as well. In Australia, where I am now, chemsex is very much about crystal methamphetamine. It's principally that drug that we're talking about. And in fact, as I understand it, still mephedrone use, is still quite uncommon outside of Europe. Mephedrone, if you're not familiar, is a synthetic cathinone. There's a whole range of terms for this phenomenon that have emerged over time. Chemsex is the one that we, I think, as health professionals have really latched onto, and that we use very often in the research that we do, in the policy and practice work that we do. Party and play is another term that's very commonly utilised. I know it's utilised in North America. It's actually the term that's used most commonly in Australia. And they're synonymous. They mean the same thing, and we're talking about the same phenomenon when we use those terms. Men themselves, gay, bisexual, other men, homosexual men themselves, use a whole range of different terms to describe their interest or their current engagement in chemsex. And they will use those terms with one another, but they will also reflect different kinds of terms on their Grindr profile, on their Scruff profile, their Hornet profile, any of the gay social networking apps. They will change and modify those terms over time. And largely that's because the owners of those apps constantly review and will ban the use of certain words that they see are associated with drug use. They don't necessarily want their applications to be visibly being used for drug-related purposes. And so they will ban the use of the term chemsex, they ban the use of the term party and play and PMP and various other derivatives or combinations of those words. And so you see men getting more and more creative about how those words are displayed so that they can indicate to other people that they're looking to engage in sexualized drug use. So you see high and horny, you might see M play for methadone, T play for, so T play is for Tina, so Tina is a street name for crystal methamphetamine. Chem play, wired play. I was in Taiwan not long ago doing some work around chemsex, and it was interesting to observe there that they often use characters from the film Frozen, which I think en français is La Reine des Neiges, and they use these character names to indicate that they're looking for ice, and ice is the street name for crystal methamphetamine, which is most commonly used in Taiwan. So a great deal of creativity to get around the app owners banning the use of certain terms. And as you're probably aware, it occurs predominantly in private homes. It's facilitated often by social networking applications and other online sites where men can advertise the fact that they're looking to engage in chemsex, that they're currently engaging in chemsex, that they're looking for people to join their group sex parties that they've organized in their private homes. It's very commonly associated with a high turnover of sexual partners, so men having a lot of partners in quick succession. We see a lot of transactional sex, men having sex in exchange for drugs. We also see, though, that there is a role for sex on premises venues for gay saunas as well. Not all chemsex is occurring in private settings, and there is still a role for saunas and other commercial spaces that gay men visit for them to understand the impact and the consequences of chemsex as well. So that's the kind of brief introduction to make sure we're all on the same page. And then I wanted to say a little about prevalence, like how big an issue are we really talking about here? How many people are engaging in chemsex? It's I want to say four things, I guess, on this point. One is that it's really hard to say with certainty. Two is that it varies based on how you ask the question, unsurprisingly. I'm a researcher, I obsess about the nuances of questions. But you get very different responses depending on whether you ask, have you engaged in chemsex? You ask it that way. Whether you say, have you used one of these drugs before or during sex within the last X number of months? Whether you just ask generally, have you used one of those drugs, and you use the use of the drugs in general as a proxy for engaging in chemsex. And you get as I said, you get a very different answer each time. And it also varies by the time period. So, sorry, I keep touching, that's going, resting on the clicker. Different surveys have asked it in different ways. So some will ask, have you engaged in chemsex in the previous 4 weeks? Some in the last 3 months, some in the last 6 months, some in the last 12 months. And so it can make it hard to kind of estimate or average out amongst those. And then finally, it varies on where you ask the question. Again, unsurprisingly, if you ask a population level question and on an online survey asked to all gay and bisexual men, you get a vastly different prevalence, and you'd observe asking it in certain social settings or certain clinical settings. And I'll highlight a few of those variations here. So let's start with the UK. So let's start with my home patch. And the UK took part in the EMIS study, European MSM Internet Survey, in 2017, and I know there's some colleagues from Public Health Canada who will be presenting some findings based on that in the next session, because Canada actually took part in this survey as well. The UK hasn't actually released their data yet, so I can't talk about the findings from the 2017 survey. The most recent survey we have at a population level comes from 2015, and it's called the Gay Men's Sex Survey. It's an online survey promoted by gay social networking apps, by Grindr. There's an awful lot of Facebook advertising. It goes out through gay community networks and organizations. And in that survey, it asks about whether men have used a whole range of different drugs. And we collapsed together anyone who said that they'd used either crystal methamphetamine or GHB or methadone within the previous 4 weeks. And if you take that as the measure, have you done that within the previous 4 weeks, then the total proportion of people across the 14,000 men in the study was 6.6%. And that's an indicator of those who might be engaging in chemsex. So I've got those slides slightly mixed up. If you look at that though, broken down by the city, then you see a really significant variation. So you actually see that 14.3% of men living in London had engaged in chemsex within the previous 4 weeks. That's about 1 in 6. If you look at that broken down by HIV status, you see that 21.9%, so more than 1 in 5 men had used drugs associated with chemsex in the previous 4 weeks. And if you look at that among HIV positive men living in London, you see 32.7%, so 1 in 3 HIV positive men likely engaging in chemsex within the previous 4 weeks. So while we might not be talking about a large proportion of the population level, really, really high rates within certain subpopulations. We look at Australia, so where I am now. In Australia, we're fortunate to have a variety of different data sources on this topic that helps give us a slightly more nuanced picture of what's going on. So the first is the Community Gay Periodic Survey. This is a survey that's been run by colleagues at the University of New South Wales. It's been running for the last 20 years. It's a survey that runs every 2 years, and it takes place at kind of gay pride events in major cities. They collect data from people attending the pride events. They also do data collection in bars and clubs and saunas as well. It's typically around about 3,000 people each time. We also have the Hiv Futures Study, which is again a periodic survey that happens every 2 years, again been running for 20 years, and this is particularly of people living with HIV. And that survey each time, it's broadly about health and well-being of people living with HIV, but it also asks a range of questions around use of drugs. And then the third one is a much newer study, and it's called Flux. It's called Following Lives Undergoing Change, is what it stands for. And this is a longitudinal cohort study of drug use. It launched in 2015 and it runs for 5 years. And the idea of this kind of study is that you recruit, it recruited about 3,500 men into the survey, and then it follows those same men over time to understand changes or patterns in their drug use. I'm going to come back to these data sources on a few occasions, so try to hold them in your mind, the different kinds of surveys. So the first one I mentioned there was the Gay Community Periodic Survey. And this is a trend analysis that shows how the use of crystal methamphetamine has changed over time. And you see that in the most recent year of the analysis, which was 2014, 11.4% had used crystal in the previous 6 months, and that had fallen from a high of about 18% in 2006. And as within the UK sample that I showed, a significantly higher proportion of use among men living with diagnosed HIV, which is what you see in the orange bar towards the top. And the HIV Futures Study, this is just gay men living with diagnosed HIV. Here you see that if you cluster together all the party and play drugs, so crystal, GHB or ketamine, 5.3% had used it regularly, which in the survey was within the previous month. And actually 90% of that 5.3% was crystal methamphetamine use. 22% had used crystal methamphetamine within the previous year. And we actually asked a few more questions about crystal methamphetamine use because we were particularly interested. And we saw that 79% commonly were smoking it, and 56% had injected at some point in the past. That's an ever measure. They'd done it at some point in the past, whereas the smoking measure was actually one that they were doing regularly. And the third was the Flux study. So this was the longitudinal cohort study, and this is data from the baseline of that. And as with all surveys of gay and bisexual men, you see that the use of amyl nitrate or amyl nitrite often, or poppers as they're commonly known. The use of amyl and the use of marijuana are the highest drug use, or drugs used most commonly among gay men. And you see that in every survey that's ever conducted on this population. The blue bar is whether they've ever done it, the green bar is whether they've done it in the last 6 months. But as I said before, if we take crystal methamphetamine as the proxy indicator for engagement in chemsex, then about 12% had done so in the last 6 months, and about 3 or 4% were regularly injecting crystal meth. If we look a little bit further afield, chemsex is not a phenomenon that is simply a high-income country issue. You see chemsex emerging in a lot of low and middle-income countries as well. I've been working with some colleagues in Taiwan on issues relating to chemsex recently, and in a study we conducted 3 or 4 months ago of over 2,000 men surveyed online through apps and online sites. Again, you see 9.3% had engaged in chemsex within the previous 3 months. A very similar study we did in Malaysia last year showed that 14.2% had engaged in chemsex in the previous 6 months. And this was a survey that should be published, should come out in the journal STIs, Sexually Transmitted Infections, any day now. This was a survey we did across 24 European countries last year. Just over 10,000 men took part, and 6.8% said that they had engaged in chemsex within the previous 3 months. Those are all population level surveys. Those are all either conducted online or they're collected across a range of gay social settings, in bars, in clubs, in gay pride events, in saunas, etc. You get a very different picture on the prevalence of drug use, understandably, when you look at clinical samples. And so this is data from a study called AURA, which is a cross-sectional attitudes to understanding risks of acquiring HIV study. Now, the first wave of data collection was in 2013, and the last wave of data collection was in 2016. These are cross-sectional surveys. It's not the same people, but they were observing the use and the change in use in drugs associated with chemsex recently. And here's the key finding to take away from that slide, in that the use of drugs associated with chemsex across 3 sexual health clinics, 2 of them in London, one that David Stewart, my colleague here, works at, and one of them in Brighton. You see that the use of those 3 drugs was 24% in 2013, but that had risen to 32% in 2016. So we see that particular clinics, men gravitate towards those clinics where they understand there is expertise, where they understand that they can get their needs met, where they understand that they're less likely to be subject to stigma or judgment by healthcare workers. And this is something we have to celebrate it's actually something to celebrate when we see these high rates in particular areas, because it says that this represents expertise in a place where people are comfortable going to talk about these issues. All of those studies I presented looking at the prevalence of chemsex also search for the predictors or the correlates of chemsex. So what are the things that are associated with chemsex? And they all arrive at very similar conclusions, to be honest. They all tell a very similar picture. One, unsurprisingly, from what I've said, is that men living with diagnosed HIV are much more likely to be engaging in chemsex, so anywhere between 2 and 5 times more likely. Definitely that men living in major gay urban centres, and we also see chemsex as much more common among men who sell sex. So they all sell sex or they engage in transactional sex. There's actually a really significant variation by age. A question I get asked a lot is it more common among younger guys or older guys? To be honest, it's a phenomenon that you see across the age spectrum. It's not easy to pinpoint in particular, although in some countries you do see that crystal meth use is slightly more common among older men, but possibly that's actually just it's an income effect. It's that crystal meth is a more expensive drug in lots of places. Older men are more likely to have the resource and the means to buy crystal meth. So that's possibly why we observe it. But then you also observe transactional sex with older men having sex with younger men in exchange for crystal meth. So it does still kind of spill into older age groups as well. It's not unique. Okay, so what does that say in summary? Prevalence, generally, it's probably anywhere between 5 and 12% if we're talking about MSM, gay men, regularly. Like, they're doing this on a regular basis. And most estimates tend to suggest it's somewhere between 5, 6, 7% at a population level. But it's most common, and it's much, much, much more common among people living with diagnosed HIV, men living in major gay urban centres. And as I said, it varies by data collection site. And although there's a lot of attention paid to injection drug use in most contexts, but by no means all, in most contexts, injection is much less common than smoking or other routes of administration, particularly of crystal meth. So there's prevalence. Here's problems. So regardless of how prevalent chemsex is, or which subpopulations are disproportionately affected, we know from an increasing body of work that for some men it does cause really significant problems. And I'll first talk about the problems or the harms that have arisen in relation to sexual health, and I'll then talk about some of the issues relating to physical and mental health. So this is often the thing that we have worried about most in this context. And there's been a lot of very hysterical news reporting blaming all of the rise that we had in HIV a few years ago and rises in STI and other sexually transmitted infections. A lot of news reporting blaming all of that on chemsex, saying this is the reason why this is all coming about. I don't buy that argument, to be honest, in full. Of course it will have an impact. Of course it will be an influencing factor. But HIV had always been rising, and STIs have always existed. They didn't come about just because of chemsex, but perhaps chemsex has had a role in the changing patterns of them in some places. We did a review of the literature, which we published 18 months ago or so, and that looks broadly across the associations between the use of drugs and sexual health. And it says there are a few kind of clear take-home messages. At a very broad level, there's an association between the use of illicit substances and an increased likelihood of reporting HIV or STI transmission risk behavior. So essentially, if you're using drugs, you're more likely to be doing some sexually risky things. At a very general level, we can definitely say that. And the strongest associations are between the use of crystal methamphetamine and engagement in unprotected anal intercourse. And in fact, you see typically threefold increase in the odds of unprotected anal intercourse when men are using crystal methamphetamine. And we see that drug use is associated with increased odds of engaging in group sex as well. And clinical studies, including the AURA study that I mentioned just a moment ago, typically report much higher odds of a recent STI diagnosis among men who use chemsex drugs compared to men who don't use chemsex drugs. Okay, so top level, definitely an association between drug use and poorer mental health. And that's reinforced by some data from the Flux study. This was the longitudinal cohort study data that I mentioned. And this is data from the baseline, and it shows people who've recently used crystal methamphetamine, and they were much more likely to have engaged in risky sexual behaviors in the last 6 months. So including condomless anal sex with casual partners, which is in the red bar, group sex with casual partners, which is the green bar, and more than 10 partners, which is the purple bar. Now, we know all of those things are very definitely associated with STI transmission risk behavior. We can't say the same is true of HIV transmission risk behavior, because in this data we don't know whether they're taking PrEP or, in this slide at least, whether they're taking PrEP or have an undetectable viral load. But we certainly know that these behaviors are very commonly associated with STI transmission. But I think we have to be very, very wary of how we attribute or how we explain this association. and not fall into the trap of making very simplistic assumptions about why this association between drug use and poorer sexual health exists. And this is a paper from a qualitative study we did back in London several years ago, and this was 30 in-depth interviews with gay men who were recently engaging in chemsex, and it helped us really understand how and why their use of drugs is impacting on their sexual behavior. And it essentially kind of outlines three different mechanisms of how that might be coming about. The first is what we might think of as a typically causal, in inverted commas, association. The kind of narrative goes, I've taken drugs, I feel very disinhibited, I feel very out of control, I'm not aware of my actions, I have a drug-related myopia, I'm not aware of what it is I'm doing, and I do risky things as a consequence. That's kind of one pathway that was constructed by some of the men that we interviewed. The opposite is also true, though. Men saying, I wanted to do something risky, I wanted to have much more kind of esoteric sex, I wanted to do much more sexually adventurous things. I didn't feel able to do those things unless I took drugs. Drugs didn't cause them to have risky sex. Drugs enabled them to have the riskier or more esoteric sex that they wanted. And then the kind of third is what's often referred to in the drug or alcohol literature as a third variable explanation. So it's men saying, well, I didn't want, I made the decision not to use condoms during sex. I made the decision not to care about the HIV status of my partners before going into that sexual setting, before I went to that party, before I went to that sauna. The drugs just helped me do it for longer. They helped me have sex with more people. They kept me sexually aroused for a longer period of time. But they weren't the reason why I was engaging in risky sexual activity. Does that make sense? Like it's not as simple as saying one caused the other. There happens to be that association, but men had made that decision to engage in riskier sexual practices, often in the cold light of day. And the kind of fourth association is to say that there is no association. And it was men that we interviewed who were using drugs. They were often using a lot of drugs. They were often having an awful lot of sex. But they weren't necessarily doing anything that was risky. And I think that's that's a smaller group of people, I've got to be honest. But it's important to recognize that it's not necessarily always problematic in relation to sexual health. If we look beyond sexual health issues though, what other problems are men experiencing? Are they finding their use of chemsex drugs more generally problematic? Well, the easiest, or at least one of the ways of understanding that, is to ask them, are you experiencing problems in relation to your drug use? And we asked them about the use of a whole range of drugs in this flux survey, this longitudinal cohort survey, and then for each of them we asked, are you experiencing any problems in relation to your drug use? And overall, if you look at any illicit drugs, 15.7%, so about 1 in 6, considered their use problematic. It's significantly higher, though, when you look at the use of crystal methamphetamine. So 44.1% felt that their use was problematic. And I think a question for us as researchers at the moment is, how does that subjective assessment of a problematic drug use compare with or correlate with an objective measure of problematic use? So I may not think I have a problem, I may not recognize I have a problem, but I actually may be in some pretty dire circumstances. And certainly we've observed that in many of the qualitative studies that we've done over the years. I think at the minute we haven't quite figured out a way of assessing that quantitatively, but that's something we're trying to unpack in the latest wave of this flux study, that kind of correlation between how I feel about my use being problematic and how that may be more objectively measured. There's also a whole range, though, of issues relating harms associated with physical and mental health, some of which I'm sure you're aware of. So particularly in the use of crystal methamphetamine, we see some very serious anxiety attacks, some crystal meth-induced psychosis, very acute paranoia. I know David can tell some really quite horrendous stories of people coming into clinic with crystal meth related psychosis who have some extremely acute mental health need that has to be addressed very immediately and can be very, very complex. We also see a great deal of sexual dependency, so people struggling to have sex without the use of drugs anymore. They struggle to have sober sex. And we also see, in many contexts, a big impact on physical health. So in those populations where they are injecting more, we actually observe quite a lot of injection site injuries. Gay men have always used more drugs, always used drugs more commonly than the heterosexual population, but they haven't as often injected drugs. And there are still a great many communities of gay men who aren't familiar with safe injection drug practices, and we do observe in quite a few places injection site injuries as a consequence. There are a lot of issues in relation to sexual consent in this context, and men reporting that they didn't remember whether they consented to the sex that they had. They woke up after having overdosed and they were aware that someone had had sex with them. They weren't always necessarily aware of whether they had sought consent from the people that they were having sex with. A lot of victim blaming, a lot of self-blaming. I put myself in this scenario. I can't possibly access help or support or go to the police because I was using an illicit substance, therefore they're going to judge me. They're going to say that it was my fault in these circumstances. A lot of that kind of narrative emerging from men in interviews, which is really troubling to observe. An overdose, and this is an issue that particularly arises in relation to GHB, to gamma hydroxybutyrate. It's a drug that you take in very small, very carefully timed doses. I'm afraid I'm not so familiar with how common it is here in Canada yet. If it is common, you'll know this already. If you're not common, pay attention to it and watch to see if and how it emerges here, because it has been the result of a great many overdoses in the UK. In fact, there was a study done by the coroner's office published last year that showed 117% increase in GHB-related deaths among men living in London between 2013 and 2016. So a person was dying of a GHB-related overdose about every 12 days in London between 2013 and 2016, which is probably higher than we observe, a probably higher proportion certainly than we observe AIDS-related deaths within that same population. But so much of the attention gets fixated on HIV and sexual health, and we actually miss the fact that the thing people are dying from right now is actually overdose, and it's important to always bear that in mind. In the Flux study, we, even though only a few hundred men had used GHB, we were able to ask about the consequences of that use. So what happened to you, or what did you get from using it? Now, overall, 40.9% of those who used GHB in the last 6 months reported overdosing at least once. It is astonishingly high compared to many other drugs. If you look at some of the, sorry if they're a little small, I can read them out, some of the other issues, other reported consequences, so 12.6% needed monthly medical attention in relation to their GHB use, and nearly 1 in 10 needed emergency admission to healthcare to help cope with the consequences of their GHB use. But there were some other quite unanticipated outcomes when we asked this question, some other unanticipated consequences of GHB use. And these tell us a lot about why people engage in chemsex in the first place. And these are some of the other things that people said. 56.3% of people using chemsex monthly saying that it brought them closer to some people. Lots of people saying how they met new friends, they gained more confidence, how they had some great parties, and more than 2/3 saying that they had better sex as a consequence of using GHB. And that's really where I want to go to in the last section of this talk, is to talk about the potentials. Like, what are the things that chemsex facilitates? What are the things that men value about engaging in chemsex? What motivates them to engage in chemsex in the first place? And on the other side of those potentials, what can we then do in response? What are the clinical, the community, and the online interventions? And what is the potential for those? And what can we be delivering in the longer term? I'm going to say a little bit less about some of the interventions, just because I'm aware that this is very much more so David Stewart's expertise, and he can speak to that with much more personal and professional experience than I can. But I'll briefly mention one or two studies that have spoken to that. So, motivations for Chemsex, values of Chemsex. Why do people engage in Chemsex? What does it facilitate? And again, these are findings from that qualitative study we did with 30 men in London in 2014. And on the basis of those interviews, we see those motivations splitting into kind of two main clusters. So one of them is about overcoming something. There is a deficit, there is something that I'm struggling with, and drugs help me overcome that. Or they're about enhancing something. So this is something I value about sex, and drugs enable me to have more of that, for it to be even better. And they're subtly different but important distinctions to make. So I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'll just highlight a few just to kind of make that clear. Men who, first is about increasing arousal and restoring libido. So men who've lost a sense of libido, particularly more common for older guys, particularly common for men who've been recently diagnosed with HIV, men saying, I simply don't have a sex drive anymore. And this guy said, I don't have a sex drive any longer. It's one of the reasons why I started slamming, injecting chems, because when I slam, I get horny. The second is around increasing sexual confidence. So for men who have body image concerns, for men who worry that they're not very good at sex, for men who feel ashamed about having sex, they have internalized HIV-related stigma, they have internalized homonegativity, well then using drugs allowed them to escape from some of those feelings. It's a really common narrative in the drug literature. It's a kind of distancing effect. I just don't think about those issues when I'm taking these different substances. This guy said, I think when I was using drugs, I didn't have body issues. I didn't think I'm feeling a bit too fat, or I'm not feeling that attractive. I'd have sex with people, and I'd like having sex like I would be normally. So those are where you're overcoming, you're using drugs to overcome an issue. But it's also about using drugs to enhance something that you particularly value. And particularly is about intensifying sexual sensations. So they can make sex feel amazing. Using crystal meth, using mephedrone, using G, it can make sex feel fantastic. And I think all so often when we talk about drug use, we ignore the fact that the fundamental reason why people use drugs is that they can feel amazing. And this is just as true in relation to chemsex as well, and we should never forget that. This guy says, it's very poetic, he says, on mephedrone, it was the best sex I ever had. I used to say it was like the heavens opened and the light came down when I had an orgasm, because it was that intense, it really was, and I've never experienced that sober. It sounds very compelling. But, and just to highlight that qualitative data is kind of replicated or repeated in the Flux study in this longitudinal cohort. And of the 500 or so men who'd used crystal in the last 6 months, the main reasons for using crystal were for fun, so by over 70%. To get a buzz was for over 60%. There are some pathological issues in there as well that they're trying to overcome. I feel like I need it to get fucked. It helps me have sex for longer. Like it's helping you overcome challenges that you're having. But fundamentally, a lot of it is about helping you have more enjoyable sex. And the last piece of data I wanted to share relates to the social dimensions of chemsex and then the notion of intimacy and connectedness when engaging in chemsex. And to be honest, this was data that maybe even I, even though I've worked in this field for a while, even I was a little bit surprised by the extent of some of these findings. And this comes from the Hiv Futures Study. This is men living with diagnosed HIV. And so as a reminder, 29% had used crystal in the last 12 months and 5% were doing so more regularly. Now, we asked them in that study a whole range of questions about the frequency of their drug use. We also had a load of measures in there, things about resilience. There were coping scales, there was a HIV-related stigma scale, there was a social connectedness and community support scale, and we were able to correlate scores on those scales with their engagement in a range of drugs, particularly crystal methamphetamine. And what do you find? Really interestingly, and very surprisingly, I think, to some, was that there was no significant difference between people engaging in chemsex and people not engaging in chemsex. There was no significant difference in relation to emotional well-being, to diagnosed depression, to anxiety, or to general social support. There was no significant difference at all. And compared with non-users, and people not engaging in chemsex, participants who occasionally or regularly used chemsex or party and play drugs actually reported higher levels of resilience, lower levels of perceived HIV-related stigma. They spent more time with friends from the LGBTI community. They spent more time with other people living with HIV. They had higher levels of support from perceived levels of support from other people living with HIV and LGBTI friends. Now, what does this tell us? It says that there are very significant social benefits of drug use in this population. And when you compare this to other populations, you see it's not unusual. And studies of opiate users in a whole variety of contexts often find that there's an experience of community, there's an experience of social support, there's an experience of connectedness among opiate users. And this is something that they value. And if we want to work with gay and bisexual men to manage or even to reduce their drug use, if that's what they want, we have to recognize that this is something fundamental about what they value. Yes, there can be all sorts of problems associated with it. Yes, they can experience a range of negative health outcomes, but there are still dimensions of that interaction with other people in that sexualized drug use setting that they value and that we need to understand. Just to kind of draw towards a close, I think the kind of notion of minority stress is one that we often use in this population to help us understand the higher rates of substance use, and it associates poor mental health outcomes with the discrimination that LGBTI people often face on a regular basis. It's a theory that's been cited literally 6,000 or 7,000 times in papers over the years. I think it's a great model, and I think it explains a lot about the variations in substance use among the population, but I think it often ignores other dimensions of use. It ignores sociality, that notion of connectedness, some of the things that I value. It doesn't really speak to notions of pleasure. It doesn't recognize the connectedness that we as a community of people engaging in chemsex may experience. And I guess fundamentally it's about recognizing that drug use among LGBTI populations isn't necessarily problematic. It might be for some people, but it isn't for all, and we just have to bear that in mind. I think the question we continually have to ask ourselves is, when is chemsex problematic? Clearly it is often, but it's not always. And it's often not problematic straight away. And one of the biggest challenges I know, and maybe David will speak to this afterwards as well, is helping men understand when it's becoming a problem for them. But we need to think about, as we're thinking about online interventions, especially in this conference, is what are the pivot points? What are the obvious places of intervention? When can we most effectively step in and offer help to men who need it? We're really good in Australia, and you're exceptionally good in Canada at harm reduction, harm minimization in drug use. So we know a lot about how we can use social networks and community networks for peer-based strategies to disseminate information about safe and drug use practices. So let's not forget all of that collective knowledge that we have in this environment. Yes, it might be a slightly new setting for drug use, but there's a great deal we know about dissemination of harm reduction information and the social support that comes from 30 years or so of HIV work among gay men in particular. There are some examples of good practice that I put up on these slides, and Jorge, I'm not sure if these go up afterwards later. You're very welcome to have a look at these. These give some good examples of community-based drug use-related work for gay and bisexual men, and they've all been evaluated very recently as well. There have been two special issues of Chemsex that we've co-edited that have been published this year. The one in the journal Sexual Health actually also has an article from Jorge and Mathieu. And if anyone's interested in these journals, I'm very happy to share them. I can send you the link so you can access them free of charge. I probably don't need to summarize, but this is a very, it's an emerging phenomenon. We know that there are a range of drugs that men are using in ever increasingly sexual circumstances. We know it's a population level, it's a minority behavior, but we know it's much, much, much higher among certain populations, and that's really where we need to be directing our efforts. And we need to be thinking through much more clearly, when is it problematic? How do we help men to identify when it might be problematic? And when is the best point that we can work with them to address and to deal with and to cope with that more convincingly, better. There's a whole range of people involved in the various studies that I mentioned today that I want to acknowledge and to say merci beaucoup.